Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is CityWorks, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. Every month here at CityWorks, we explore the lives of working people at home or at work in New York and the greater urban landscape. We begin today's show with Labor Studies Professor Penny Lewis from the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Professor Lewis wears many hats: scholar, author, union organizer, and in the middle of all that, somehow has written on a range of subjects. Just out is her latest book, A People's Guide to New York City, which delves into all 5 boroughs, their histories, and, as Time Out New York puts it, their sites of struggle and resistance. Penny, congratulations. I love this book.
Laura, thank you.
I am absolutely one of those people who reads every plaque on the wall, who calls, groups to a stop so that we can find out where we are and what happened there. And that's exactly what you've done for all 5 boroughs with all sorts of stories I had no idea about. Why did you think this was needed?
Well, I should first say this is a co-authored book,
Yes.
and there are 2 fellow authors who worked on this book every inch of the way with me, Carolina Bank Munoz and Emily Thompson Molina, who are our colleagues at Brooklyn College. One of the reasons why we took this on is because classical guidebooks focus on, we think, many of the wrong things if you're really trying to understand a city. And so we sought to make what the whole series talks about as a deliberate political disruption in the way that you encounter a city, both as you walk around and as you sit in a classroom, because we think this book can be used in both places. And I think that when you walk around a city, especially with a classical guidebook, you tend to focus on the things that the book and our dominant culture say are what is notable and what's historical and what's important. And for us, what's important is the social power that contributes to a city and the struggles that make it look the way it is and create the lives that those of us who live in cities lead.
So give us an example. I mean, in the introduction, you talk about the Mohawk iron workers who helped to put up so many buildings in this city, and there's a certain amount been known about them. But what I didn't know was about the community that they settled in, the bar that was there, and the fact that it was around the Union Hall. This is a labor show. So tell us how significant Union Halls were as you looked at patterns of sort of community around New York City.
I mean, what we tried, so in the introduction, we start with the Empire State Building, and then, which is one of the many buildings that the Mohawk Iron Workers from Canada contributed to and helped build. And then we train our attention to the community in North Gowanus, where these iron workers lived. And over again, you find in these communities halls, community spaces, places of organizing. Sometimes it's bars, sometimes it's schools, community centers, and certainly throughout this book, those are the kinds of sites that we want to pay attention to. So we made the juxtaposition of, a normal guidebook would talk about the Empire State Building. We want to look at the Wigwam Bar, that used to be on Nevin Street, and talk about the people who helped build the Empire State Building. And similarly, many of our sites tell that kind of a story, that there might be a very notable event that took place over there, but this is where people organized it, or this is where the people who lived made that happen.
Is there an equivalent to Union Halls today as a gathering space? I'm thinking also probably independent bookstores, places like that, but is there anything you think is sort of the current site of gathering that people will be writing in their People's Guide to New York decades hence?
Yeah, there are spaces like the May Day space in Bushwick, where they open up their doors very specifically to community groups to come in and make use of it. And then they also have a, kind of a bar gathering space as well. And that's, one of the ways in which a union hall operates, is to allow people to meet and also to have parties and celebrations. We still have union halls too. In fact, our union has a hall, and when we're not under COVID circumstances, it's a site of many fantastic film screenings and things like that. But I would also say, and this is a notable thing about New York that we tried to emphasize in this book, that we are a city with a very rich, if underfunded, public infrastructure. And so New York is lucky to have, although decaying, many public sites that allow people to gather. So Tompkins Square Park, our parks are beautiful, and Occupy Wall Street was organized out of, Tompkins Square Park. The City University of New York, where we are, is a fantastic, vibrant public institution. And we produce spaces for people to gather and make changes, libraries, et cetera. So,
do you have favorite stories? Are there places now that you just, you get excited walking down the street knowing what happened there?
For sure. There are a lot. One, the impact that the Young Lords Party had on New York City in the short time that they were here, the garbage offensive that they enacted as one of the very first things that they did. This is in, I think, 1969, in East Harlem or El Barrio, where the community was very angered by the amount of trash on the streets, right? This is a community that had undergone urban renewal. So a lot of buildings had been razed, a lot of vacant lots and trash, and the city wasn't picking up the garbage. People were furious. And so the Young Lords Party went and confronted the sanitation department and said, we need some brooms, whatever. They eventually piled up trash in major intersections all across El Barrio, not a few intersections, and made a spectacle of the fact that the city wasn't picking up the garbage. So when I'm there, I love thinking about, that kind of use of the space and spectacle that forced a change, like a real change in the city. So that's one of many stories that I love.
There's a slew of great stories in here. I know I'm going to be carrying the book around. Before I let you go, Penny, I also have to ask you about one of the other hats that you wear. You, as I understand it, represent a lot of the faculty and staff here at CUNY as a part of the Professional Staff Congress.
Yes.
And have just been in Albany negotiating for good wages and things for people who work right here at CUNY.
Well, we're not in negotiations for the contract yet, but I'm the secretary of our union, and we represent 30,000 faculty and professional staff. And we continue to be engaged in a big struggle to win the funding that we need and that we've been denied for decades and decades and decades at the City University of New York.
In the state budget.
In the state budget. And this year was we had a very amazing advance in that for the first time we've had increases, the level of increase that we got compared to I've been here almost 2.5 decades. We got more this year than we've ever gotten. And what it's going to mean is that CUNY has more operating funds than it's had in decades. But, and that's fantastic. And that happened because our union and the CUNY Rising Alliance and our allies and community partners and really fantastic legislators who've been elected recently from left, organizing in the city made that happen. So we had fantastic rallies and pressure, and 75 members of the legislature have signed on to our bill called the New Deal for CUNY. And so we've turned a corner, but we have so far to go also. We have to make up for decades.
All right.
And so it's been an exciting
But I can hear people
stretch.
cheering, though, all over. So far, so good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And more to go.
Thank you, Professor Penny Lewis, for joining us on CityWorks. Up next, excerpts from a School of Labor and Urban Studies public program on worker pension investments and their huge place in a progressive economy. Stay tuned for that.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
In April, the School of Labor and Urban Studies hosted a public program featuring two outstanding scholars, Samir Santi, Urban Studies professor right here at CUNY SLU, and Benjamin Braun, senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Societies. Both scholars have written about funded pensions, what some call the world's single most consequential financializing force over the past half century. To find out more, here are some excerpts.
You're talking specifically about funded pensions. You use this term funded pensions. So before we drill deeper into this, why don't we just establish what funded pensions are? Most people probably associate pensions with retirement, but there are also other things that come to mind. Maybe, there's union pension plans, there's 401ks, there's IRAs, Social Security, and so on. So can you just talk a little bit about the landscape of retirement programs and then explain specifically what pension funds are?
A claim on a retirement income is always a claim on future production in a way, right? And then there is the question, how does a society organize this? That when you don't work, someone will pay you money, will pay you an income. And so there are two very basic ways to organize this. And one that is relatively marginal, but still important in the US is a pay-as-you-go system. So this is a system where the young basically pay taxes of some sort or social contributions, and this money gets passed on via some state institutions to the old who are no longer working. So in such a pay-as-you-go system, of which Social Security is a pay-as-you-go system, there is no financial intermediation, but still people working today acquire a claim on future production, because when they retire, it's the production of the then young who are in the labor market that sustains their claim on Social Security, or in Germany this is actually our main pension. The first, what we call the first pillar, is a pay-as-you-go system that every employed person has a claim on such a retirement income that is to some extent tied to your income while you're working. Then the alternative is a funded pension system, and all the examples that you mentioned, of course, are ways of organizing a funded pension system. So here too, you acquire a claim on future production, but you acquire this by saving money today, investing that money via some financial vehicles in financial assets, which are, of course, a financial asset is nothing but a claim on future production, whether that's a bond or a share. And so again, ultimately, what your claim on future workers via a pay-as-you-go system or via a share, or let's say an index fund in the S&P 500, that the claim of the value of that claim in 30 years depends on the size of the economy in 30 years, simply put. But these are just two different ways of organizing such a claim. And then within the funded pension system, there are different financial mechanisms, ranging from collective schemes, such as state pension funds or private sector defined benefit plans, to individual plans, such as 401ks and IRAs, but also, for example, life insurance. Life insurance has actually arguably globally a longer history as a way of saving for old age. Goes back a long time.
Maybe we should just say a word about capital stewardship and the labor movement in particular. I mean, I should just, I think it's important always to say up front, the labor movement is the reason that pension funds exist. Unions have fought for, the retirement security of members for decades, and within a very constrained political environment. So that, and we've ended up with what we've got. And within this kind of contradictory universe that you've described, unions have also for decades sought to be as strategic as they can about how to utilize the power that they might have, and not without some success, right? The Justice for Janitors campaign, which a lot of our listeners may be familiar with, is only the most famous example, I think, of some of these efforts. But again, you're pointing out some tensions within this, and raising some doubts about the long-term efficacy of such a strategy that others have advocated for. So maybe just a quick minute or two, if you want to respond to that. You've already kind of laid out some thoughts on it, but if you want to respond to that before we move to audience questions.
Yes, absolutely. I should also mention maybe David Weber's book, which I've learned a lot from on this, Labor's Last Best Weapon, where really a lot of these successes that you mentioned of pension fund campaigns to wield labor's capital in a way that benefits workers are described. And lots of successes for in individual cases. The trap, in a way, that we're in is not unique to the US again. It just plays out particularly starkly there, which is that, in order for pension funds to, or in general, savers saving for retirement, regardless of the vehicle, including the savers in IRAs and 401ks, of course, to achieve returns that will allow them to have adequate income in retirement, there was a vested interest, so to speak, in financial liberalization. I mentioned the example of hedge funds, for example. When hedge fund investment was opened, pension funds followed and invested in this new asset class. This was in 1996 by an act of Congress. I don't know the politics in detail, but it was not preordained. It happened. And this keeps happening. And so the alternative, so there are two alternatives. One is a pay-as-you-go system, which, there's an interesting trend globally in a rollback of some pension privatizations in a number of countries in Latin America and Eastern Europe, especially, because there are just so many contradictions in a fully privatized pension system. So the shine has come off of this model a little bit since Chile first, became a star and lodestar for this movement. But probably this is not entirely realistic to just phase out private retirement provision and scale up Social Security via more progressive forms of taxation than now, of course. And then the other alternative is can we return to something like this fiscal mutualism of the post-war period, where pension institutional capital pools in general and pension funds in particular can be basically development funds, local development funds that invest locally in infrastructure projects, in projects related to the green transition, and so on and so forth. And I think the road, it's always a little fanciful maybe to talk about a return to the 60s. And of course, in the US, this is even more problematic for different reasons, but just purely in terms of financial regulations, it's quite clear what's needed. There were capital controls, which means that domestic investors cannot roam the world in search of, I have an example, like any European real estate investment, private equity enterprise, you look who are the largest investors. They are US public pension funds. So there would have to be a limit for that, capital controls of some sort, and then just a much larger footprint of the state in the financial system, which the buzzword here would be the ugly buzzword, and politically certainly problematic, but it would be some form of financial repression, which is a term used by people generally opposed to this sort of politics. but yeah, a much larger footprint for public banking, and there are currently very interesting policy proposals coming out from the US, such as a national investment authority, NIA, and these kinds of things that would generate projects that then pension funds could invest in. The returns might be lower, and then maybe there would have to be a larger public or pay-as-you-go component to if you will, recapitalize the pension system, or to add a larger transfer component. This would be the other side of the coin, because you couldn't have private equity returns maybe necessarily. I'll stop there.
I think that's a great way to tie this all together to kind of the big picture macro questions that we're grappling with. And while we're on this subject, I feel like I have my obligatory plug for the Postal Workers Union's proposal for postal banking as another dimension to thinking about how we might reform
exactly
this.
That sort of thing.
We've been talking a lot about labor and workers' capital and the impacts of this on the world of work, but we have a question here about the climate and the climate crisis, and how all of this figures into the broader, crisis upon us. Well, that's the way I'll summarize this very thoughtful question.
All right, yes, that's another big one, and I don't think I'm able to give a satisfying answer to that, but this comes down to who's going to finance the green transition, if anyone, right? And there is a battle going on, I would say, although the battle is playing out mostly in a relatively small bubble of heterodox economists and political economists. And then the mainstream discourse is very much dominated by the idea at this point that private finance is going to finance the green transition, and that well, the state is mainly there to de-risk, in the words of my colleague Daniela Gabor, is a de-risking state that needs to de-risk green investments so that institutional capital pools and their asset managers can invest in them while still meeting their yield requirements and yield targets, so that these investments are often very high risk, can be high risk when they are in untested technologies, or they can be low yield if they are in public infrastructure which is not necessarily made to produce high returns for private investors. So the state needs to subsidize this for investors. The alternative would be, of course, a much more state-led investment regime, where basically the state closes down alternative investment and crowds in capital into green infrastructure investments and so on and so forth. But again, then we are in a world in which there is significant financial repression. And of course, in the best world, this giant pile of pension fund money, these 35 trillion, would be invested in projects designed to create a world that's still inhabitable in 50 years, which is when a lot of the people who are currently paying into these funds are going to retire. So it would be in everyone's interest. But we're nowhere close to that world, I think.
We've got some policy ideas, but what in terms of people who are in pension plans, the majority of people who aren't, I mean, what can we do? What kind of campaigns can we run? And how can we fight for a more just retirement system, financial system, workplace environment?
I think the campaigns to run, or the topics to focus on, should go beyond corporate governance, for example, and should go beyond achieving better best practice for private equity investments and so on, but should really, the goal should be to advance an agenda of radical financial reform, and this is really, I choose this work deliberately because we are far from this world where pension funds finance the green transition. And so a national investment authority would be great, and basically ending private equity as it exists today would be great. Capital controls should be under consideration. Nationalizing parts of the financial system. The problem, as I describe it, say at the very end of my paper, is that the fact that there are these $35 trillion of pension money, also there is a sequencing problem, because in a way, for everything to get better for workers, for labor, and therefore for everyone, it needs to get worse for labor's capital first. And the really tricky question in a way is how to, the politically tricky question is how to compensate labor's capital for the loss that you'll have to impose on labor's capital to get to this radically changed financial system.
Samir Santi and Benjamin Braun from a recent discussion on funded pensions. That's it for our show today. If you have comments or questions, write to us at cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thanks for watching.